What's going on, everyone? So today I want to answer this question, tell me about yourself, because it's a big question that's asked in a lot of interviews. I actually was just asked it because I'm in business school now, and I had a mock interview today, and I answered it, and I got some really good feedback. They told me I really knew what I was talking about, so I figured I don't know how good I'm going to stay at this. I don't know if it'll continue to be this good, so might as well publish this video because right now I'm really good at answering this question, so I can help others. So the approach I'm going to take today is discussing with you my credibility for showing you how to answer this question. I'm going to then give you a general overview, and then I'm going to take you through how I've done this with the beginning, middle, and end in terms of how to approach the question. And then I will give you a sample answer to the way I answer the question. Tell me a bit about yourself, and hopefully that might help you all. So in terms of credibility, I've done a lot of interviews. The issue with the medical school is you have to interview at 20, 30 schools sometimes. Same with business school. I interviewed for business schools last year. I've applied for a lot of jobs in terms of research and internships. The other reason I feel like I'm a bit decent at this is because I'm a very introspective person. So when someone asks me to tell them about myself, I feel like I know exactly what my positives are, I know what my negatives are, and knowing where the person is coming from, I can sometimes cater my story to kind of saying like, oh, you're from finance. I'm really interested in, game theory, economics, and kind of catering to a lot of people's interests and knowing where my interests fall. So with that, I want to give you some general overview of how to address this question. Tell me about yourself. This question is usually asked at the beginning of almost any interview as a way to pitch yourself. It's found in both medical schools and business schools, so I can tell you that that's one of the big overlaps between the two. And again, it's a great way to pitch yourself. If you do this right, it can actually give a really good impression of yourself to the interviewer and be like, oh wow, this person really knows what they're talking about and I want to learn more about them. But if you freak out and you don't really have a structure of approaching it, it can also be a detriment to you because sometimes it can also seem like you're all over the place. So hopefully this video will give you a way to structure that. I usually like to keep this question at around 2 minutes, try to answer it within 2 minutes. Enough to give the background and big points about your personality, but not too long such that the interviewer gets tired of hearing your voice. So, before you start answering this question or even coming up with a draft to answer this question, I want you to do a self-exercise. If I was interviewing you, what 2 things would you want me to take away from hearing this answer? So the reason I ask this is because it's a great way to frame the question. So for example, for me, when I'm thinking about how I want to answer this question, I often think like, okay, this is an interviewer for a medical school. I want this interviewer to take away that I'm pre-req. I am a student who's very passionate about healthcare, really interested in entrepreneurship, loves running, and wants to find a bridge between all 3 of these passions when he becomes a doctor. So it's kind of like a 2-sentence summary, like, okay, what do I want to get across? I want to get across I'm interested in medicine, I'm interested in entrepreneurship, and I also want to have a work-life balance. And so I want people who interview me to walk away with like, okay, prereq is that guy who likes entrepreneurship, medicine, and work-life balance, right? And so by doing that, I now know what I want to do and structure in my answer such that that impression gets conveyed effectively. So now what I'm going to do is break down the answer of tell me about yourself into the beginning, middle, and end, right? So the beginning is usually start from whenever you see like the start of your life, right? It doesn't have to be when you were born, but it generally, at least for me, usually is when I was born. And also, if this were a story, the beginning is setting a stage for the type of person you are, right? So what I mean by that is, what big parts of your childhood have shaped your identity today? So in my beginning, I usually say, oh, hey, I'm pre-req. I was actually born in India. I lived there for about 5 years, and then I moved to California in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, which is where I grew up and spent most of my childhood. And so by those 2 sentences, I'm setting up the stage of saying like, okay, I'm an immigrant. That's a very important part of my identity. I really identify as an immigrant, a first-generation immigrant. More importantly, I'm an immigrant from India, right? India is a very meaningful place for me. It's where my culture is from. It's where a lot of the values I take deep pride in come from, like family, right? And cultural meanings. And basically a lot of these identities, who I am as a person, come from India. And then I say a bit about California, the Bay Area. And by that, I'm trying to convey like I'm from the Bay. Silicon Valley, entrepreneurship, innovation. These things definitely shaped who I was as a person growing up, and that's one of the reasons I mentioned that I'm from the Bay. So that way, later on down the line, when I mention entrepreneurship, I actually have a connection. Like, I grew up like 2 minutes away from Apple headquarters. So clearly that had a very profound impact on me, even though I myself had not known that at the time being. The middle. So the middle of the answer should now hit the climax of who you are as a person, right? It's the meat of what you want the interviewer to take away. For me, that comes in the form of my college experience, right? But for other people, it might come in the form of like, what meaningful job did you do over the last 10 to 15 years that impacted who you are as a person today? And so for me, this part usually implies, okay, I grew up in California, and then I went to UC Berkeley, where I developed a deep passion for biological sciences as well as entrepreneurship. Right? The meat of who I am as a person was actually mostly college for me, because now I'm in medical school. So when I was interviewing for medical school, the meat of this question and the answers to this question came from my college experience, because that's really where I figured out, here are my passions, here are the life experiences that have informed these passions, and here is why I am, ultimately coming here today to apply to medical school. So with that being said, the middle of this question needs to answer like, who are you? Are you a future doctor? A future employee of a company that you're interviewing at, or are you a future manager of the company that you're employing at, right? So you really want to answer that question. And last but not least, the end of this question should link back everything you just talked about and how it brings you to the specific place you're at today. So, for example, I told you about how I was from India, I grew up in the Silicon Valley, I went to UC Berkeley, and then I might talk a bit about my experiences there. But at the end of the day, how does all of that, how does that aggregate sum bring you to the chair that you're sitting in today at the interview? How does it bring you to, interviewing for a product manager job at Google? How do those experiences bring you to this interview that you're having at Yale School of Medicine? How does all of that connect, bring you in front of me as the interviewer? What exactly is it that defines your life story, and how does it bring you to this place? And by doing that, I think you will, first of all, summarize who you are as a person, show the relevant experiences that have shaped you as a person, and then tie it all back to, all of those experiences came together to make Pre-Rack, and Pre-Rack is really interested in this, and that's ultimately why he's applying to this medical school, right? So now I want to really give you a sample answer, because I did one of these today, and I think it may be really helpful to see it in action. So the context for this is going to be, I'm an MD MBA candidate that's recruiting for an internship at a small startup. So let's pretend like you're interviewing me, and you're maybe the CEO of this small startup, and you're saying, okay, Pre-Rack, I don't know anything about you. Tell me a bit about yourself. And this is how I would answer, okay? So I'd start with this, essentially. Hi, I'm Pre-Rack Juthani. So my story really begins in India, actually. That's where I was born. I lived there for about 5 years before I moved to California with my parents and my sister. And we moved around a little bit, but we lived primarily in California, Bay Area, which is where I grew up. I ended up going to school at UC Berkeley. So go Bears. I went there for 4 years. And in those 4 years, I really developed a passion for biological sciences. So I majored in molecular biology and public health, and that is really where my passion stood. Not to mention, I had multiple life experiences with, family health issues that inspired me to pursue medicine. So after 4 years, I was pretty set on going to medical school. But before I could apply, I had to take a gap year, because it takes about a year to apply. So in that gap year, I actually ended up doing 2 big projects that developed my fascination with entrepreneurship. So college was where medicine really sat in, and entrepreneurship developed in my gap year. Because in my gap year, what I did was I created an organic chemistry board game, and that was entirely crowdfunded. We raised over $30,000 and ultimately brought this board game to life, and it's called React, the organic chemistry board game. And it's actually on sale right now, and it's awesome that we were able to create this idea into a product. And the second thing I did in my gap year was that I created a YouTube channel to help increase educational accessibility for pre-medical students, because I felt like that was a need that wasn't being met entirely. And even that channel to this day has grown quite a bit, and it's actually huge now. I think over like 20,000 subscribers. So both of those projects really fostered my passion for entrepreneurship, which is why going into medical school, I knew that I wanted to be a doctor, but I also wanted to be a bit more than a doctor. I wanted to be a doctor and something else. And ultimately, that drove me to apply for an MBA because I knew I wanted to get the proper skill set to explore my entrepreneurial side. And I felt like the MBA would give me the tools and skills I would need to be a doctor, but also be able to innovate as a doctor. And ultimately, I knew that to learn the fascinating skills and the concrete skill set behind entrepreneurship, the best way to do that would be at a small startup. And that's ultimately why I'm applying to your company. Because I feel like it's one thing to go through the entrepreneurship process, but it's another thing to actually be at a small startup and learn the concrete skills that you need to take an idea to fruition at a level of massive scale. And that's ultimately what I'm hoping to do with this opportunity. So hopefully that answer kind of showed you guys the beginning, middle, and end of my Tell Me a Bit About Yourself. You'll see that I talked about my identity growing up. I talked about where my passion for medicine came from. I talked about where my passion for entrepreneurship came from, and ultimately why all of those things brought me to the seat that I was sitting in today. I don't think it was ideal by any means. I don't think it's like a perfect 10 out of 10, but I do think it's a great place to start. And based on some of the feedback I've gotten from my advisors, this definitely seems to be a decent answer. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.